My stepdad abandoned me in the hospital to go on vacation. I called my dad and CPS got involved when my mom tried to make me lie. Kevin, my stepfather, disgusts me. He is one of the most annoying, controlling, and disrespectful guys I've ever met. Since he married my mother, my life has been turned upside down. My parents divorced 3 years ago. Mom and dad didn't get along and fought frequently. When they announced their divorce, I wasn't surprised. They had never been a wonderful match from the beginning. They tried to make the marriage work, but there was constant conflict, particularly over household obligations. Although my mother was legally a stay-at-home parent, she didn't enjoy any of the traditional household chores that came with that role. Cooking, cleaning, and even assisting me with my homework were never her top priorities. She made no secret of her hatred for those activities. Instead, she spent most of her time glued to her phone attempting to grow an online following. She fancied herself a beauty influencer, often recording or publishing content despite her modest following. When she wasn't on her phone, she spent a lot of her time and a good chunk of my father's money on shopping trips, brunches, and beauty treatments. These were her regular activities. She never really fit the stereotype of a typical mother. While most parents check their children's schoolwork and ensure they are keeping up in school, my mother's primary focus was always herself. She was preoccupied with her looks and wanted me to always be skinny and put together, as if I were a reflection of her image rather than an individual with my own needs. Following the divorce, both of my parents were granted shared custody, and my time was divided between them. It took me some time to adjust to living in two different families, and just as I was becoming settled, my mother met Kevin. She was smitten from their first date. They began dating officially within days, and after only a few weeks, my mother forced me to meet him. Suddenly, this complete stranger was everywhere, and I was expected to warmly welcome him into our lives. Now, if Kevin were a great person, I wouldn't have had any problems embracing him, but he is far from it. Kevin had excessive expectations from the beginning. He expected that I would gladly embrace him as my new father, despite the fact that he was a complete downgrade from my biological father. He continually meddles in my life and seems to find every opportunity to mock me, regardless of what I do. He finds a way to criticize or control me. For example, he has two sons, and he becomes visibly irritated anytime he believes I'm acting too girly, as he likes to put it. He has explicitly stated that I should not wear dresses or tight skirts, as if how I dress is any of his business. He also insists that I never let my hair down and that I always wear my long hair in a bun. It doesn't stop there. When I have friends around, he always interrupts us, claiming he's just checking in. But it's not just a brief hello or a casual query. He barges in and hovers around, as if he doesn't trust me and my friends to be alone. It's really obtrusive and frankly humiliating. When I complain or urge him to leave us alone, he dismisses it, stating things like girls require constant supervision and that we should just pretend he isn't even around. It's irritating that he doesn't interfere as much with his sons or feel the need to constantly monitor their movements. When I've tried to express how much this worries me to my mother, hoping for support or at least some understanding, she just dismisses it. She claims he's just being protective, as if that excuses his actions. On top of everything, Kevin's two sons make my life even more difficult. They have no sense of personal space, and their personalities contradict mine in every aspect. They are also relentless when it comes to bullying me. They continuously tease, mock, and find new ways to make me feel small, and instead of intervening, my mother dismisses their behavior, stating that that's how all siblings bond. When my mother decided to marry Kevin after only a year of dating, she expected me to simply fall in line. She made it clear that she loved Kevin and was determined to make their marriage work. She knew I had reservations and frustrations, but she was clear about what she expected from me to give Kevin a chance without making things difficult for her. She begged me to welcome him as a member of our family. It seemed like a lot to ask, especially considering how quickly everything was occurring, but I wanted to assist her while keeping the peace, so I agreed to try. Since then, I have made a genuine attempt to accept Kevin and his sons. I've tried to follow his routines and adapt. One of the things that upset me the most is Kevin's insistence that I refer to him as Dad. It doesn't feel right, and every time I say it, I can't help but feel animosity rising within me. I already have a father, and I do not want to replace him. However, Kevin doesn't seem to realize or care that it is difficult for me. Beyond the name, what is truly upsetting is my mother's shift in focus and goals after her marriage. She seemed to be more concerned with Kevin's sons than with me. She spends more time with them, assists them in ways. She is simply a mother to Kevin's sons now. I'd want to live with my father, especially because he's normally more understanding. However, he had to relocate for a new job in another city, which paid him substantially more. He pays me occasional visits, but I live with my mother full time. Dad and I also communicate on the phone frequently. He is aware of some of my concerns with Kevin and his son since I have discussed them with him. He's really supportive and has even attempted to talk to my mother about the matter. I believe he sincerely wants to assist, but whenever he brings it up, my mother shuts him down. She tells him to back off and says he shouldn't meddle with her marriage. Despite everything, I've worked hard over the years to acclimate to life with my new family. I've really tried to make an effort with Kevin and his sons, believing that if I remained patient and transparent, we could develop a good relationship. But despite my best attempts, I continue to feel invisible within my own family. This year, Kevin was suddenly promoted at work. When he got home, he excitedly declared that he'd be taking us all on a family trip. We were all excited by the news, especially since we hadn't been on a vacation together in a long time. He and Mom chose the location and reserved tickets and lodging for all of us. Unfortunately, just a day before our trip, I was involved in a car accident with my mother. We were heading home from shopping for some clothing for our impending vacation when another automobile smashed into us from behind. It wasn't a major collision, but it was enough to throw us off course and cause some injuries. My mother was generally fine with a few scrapes and bruises here and there, but I wasn't that fortunate. The accident caused me to break my arm and suffer a concussion. The ambulance arrived and I was quickly brought to the hospital. When Kevin initially learned of our accident, he rushed to the hospital, appearing concerned. At first I assumed he was really concerned for my and my mother's well-being and that he had come to see us. But then he kept bringing up the trip, agonizing over whether we'd still be able to travel and worrying that the money he'd invested would be wasted. The physicians eventually advised us that, due to my concussion, I would need to spend a few days in the hospital for observation. They wanted to make sure I was okay before allowing me to return home. Kevin glanced at me irritated, as if I were to blame for getting into the accident and wasting his money. My mother half-heartedly offered to remain with me while I was in the hospital. It gave me hope that she would choose to help me during such a tough moment. Kevin, on the other hand, was quick to respond, stating that because our plane tickets had already been purchased, he argued that my mother should not waste even more money by staying behind. He then turned to me and said that at my age, I should be able to stay in the hospital alone for a few days. He mentioned how safe the hospital was with physicians and nurses available 24 hours a day. Kevin then insisted that once I was discharged, he would arrange for a babysitter to stay with me at home. I argued with Kevin that I didn't want to be alone in the hospital or have a babysitter look after me at home. I urged my mother to stay with me instead. At first, my mother tried to defend me, telling Kevin that it wasn't proper to leave me alone in the hospital. She knew it was wrong. Kevin, however, continued to push back. He insisted that my mother's presence was unneeded, and that her staying would mean sitting by my side doing nothing meaningful all day. He made it appear as if her presence was pointless, entirely neglecting the emotional support she could truly offer. Kevin prioritized avoiding spending his vacation money over anything else. It was evident that he didn't consider me to be his biological child, and thus he didn't care how I felt or what had happened to me. I pleaded that at 15 years old I shouldn't be left alone in the hospital. I was terrified and in agony, and the prospect of going through this without any family members around was overwhelming. I proposed a solution, stating that Mom could contact my father to come and stay with me while she and Kevin went on their trip. Sure, it would take him some time to get here because he lived in another city, but I was confident he'd come right away if he realized I was in the hospital. I figured this would allow them to continue their vacation while keeping me company. But Kevin rejected the notion almost immediately. He ignored my concerns, calling me foolish for making such a big deal out of small injuries. He dismissed my suggestion of calling my father, arguing that it would just make him worry more. Kevin felt there was no need to interrupt anybody else's plans over something as minor as a concussion and a fractured arm, which he believed would mend well with a few days of hospital rest. In the end, Kevin's pressure was effective. I stared at my mother, hoping she would hold her ground and insist on staying with me, but as usual she caved to Kevin. Instead of fighting for what I needed, she decided to go. She only stayed with me for one night, which provided some consolation. I clung to the hope that after seeing how vulnerable I was, she would realize I needed her presence. But the next day, Kevin arrived at the hospital to pick her up and take her with him on the trip. And that was it. I was left alone for the rest of the time. Kevin didn't even check in on me. I spent the next few days in that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the constant beeping of machines and the smell of antiseptic. The nurses were kind, but their brief visits only served to highlight how truly alone I felt. The hospital was full of people, but none of them were my family. I barely remembered the details of the accident, my mind still a little fuzzy from the concussion. What I did remember clearly and painfully was how my stepfather had shrugged off my need for support, how my mother had chosen his company over mine, and how they'd both left me in a place where I was supposed to be safe, but felt anything but. The first night was the hardest. My mother had sat by my bed the evening of the accident, but by the time the morning came she was gone. I knew she loved me, or at least I used to believe that, but in that moment it felt like I didn't exist for her, not really. I couldn't remember a time when I'd felt so invisible. Her devotion to Kevin was clear now, louder than any words she could have said. I understood that marriage was important to her, that she wanted to make it work, but I couldn't understand how that was more important than being there for me when I needed her the most. As the days passed, I tried to make peace with my situation. I told myself that it was only a few more days, that my father would be here soon. I clung to that thought like a lifeline, even though I knew he was miles away. I knew that the moment he could, he would come, and I would finally have someone who understood. Someone who hadn't just turned their back on me. But when he arrived, the pain I felt wasn't just physical, it was the sharp sting of abandonment that had been building for months, if not longer. I had always hoped that things would get better, that my mother would wake up to what Kevin was doing, to the way he was manipulating her. But she never did. Instead, she just got further lost in the idea of being a perfect family with him. Dad arrived on the third day of my hospital stay. His face was lined with concern, and the moment he saw me his arms opened up. For a moment it was like I was a little girl again, safe in his embrace, where nothing could hurt me. But as he sat beside my bed, his frustration was evident. He hadn't known just how much things had spiraled since the divorce, and when he heard what had really happened during my hospitalization, he was furious. Not only was he upset by Kevin's refusal to care for me, but he was also crushed by the fact that my mom had allowed it to happen. "You shouldn't have been left alone," Dad said, his voice soft but filled with anger. "This isn't how things should have gone." I just nodded, the weight of everything pressing down on me, and I couldn't hold it in any longer. The tears that had been building up for days finally spilled over, and I started to cry, quietly at first, then in racking sobs. Dad rubbed my back, but even that small comfort didn't make me feel better. I was tired of being the one who always had to forgive, to bend to everyone else's expectations, and to pretend like nothing was wrong. I was tired of feeling like I was invisible to the people who were supposed to love me the most. When my mother finally called later that day, I had no interest in speaking to her. I didn't want to hear her excuses. I didn't want to hear how sorry she was or how understanding Kevin was in his own way. I didn't care anymore. I had already lived through her silence, her absence. What could she say now that would change anything? "Why won't you talk to me?" she asked when I picked up the phone reluctantly. "I'm sorry, baby, I'm sorry I had to go with Kevin. You know how he is." I didn't say anything for a moment, just listened to her desperate tone. "You left me there," I finally said, my voice trembling with emotion. "You just—" "I didn't want to leave you, but we had to go, honey," she said, the explanation coming too easily, as if the whole thing had been justified in her mind. Kevin was so upset, and the tickets. There it was. There it was, in full clarity. Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. She hadn't stayed because Kevin's trip. She hadn't stayed because, in her eyes, I was fine. I was just a 15-year-old who could tough it out. I didn't need my mom, not really. "You didn't stay because you don't care," I whispered, the words cutting me deep, but I couldn't stop them. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke again, it was softer but still filled with an excuse. "That's not true, sweetie. You know I care about you. I just—" I didn't know how to respond. I couldn't make her understand how much she had hurt me, how much her choices had shattered the bond we once had. Instead, I simply hung up the phone. I couldn't bear to hear any more. I was tired of hearing her try to explain her actions, tired of hearing her justify why I was the one who had to be left behind. The next few days blurred together. I recovered physically, the pain in my arm and head starting to subside. But emotionally, I was a mess. The weight of everything kept pressing down on me. I had tried to be a good daughter. I had tried to understand my mother's choices, but every time I did, I ended up feeling more and more like an outsider in my own family. Dad stayed with me for the remainder of my hospital stay, and while I appreciated him being there, it wasn't the same. I had wanted my mom, not just someone who could be there out of obligation. By the time I was finally released from the hospital, I was still processing everything. My mother and Kevin had come and gone, and though my mom made a weak attempt to apologize, it didn't do anything to heal the wound. It wasn't just the accident, and it wasn't just the fact that she had left me in the hospital. It was everything that led up to that moment, the constant choices she had made to prioritize Kevin and his sons over me. The way she ignored my concerns, dismissed my feelings, and pretended everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. When we got home, the house felt empty. It wasn't the silence I had hoped for, it was the absence of any real connection. Kevin wasn't home, and I didn't expect him to be. I didn't want to see him, didn't want to talk to him. My mom, on the other hand, she bought me a small gift, a token of her apology, but it didn't matter. She was still the same. Kevin was still the same. Nothing had changed. It was then that I realized maybe things would never go back to how they were before. I couldn't pretend that my family was whole anymore, that I was a part of it in the way I had been. I wasn't going to let myself be the only one holding on to something that didn't exist anymore. I could no longer pretend that everything was okay. I couldn't keep letting my mother's choices destroy my sense of self-worth, nor could I keep hoping that Kevin would magically become the father figure I never needed. My life had changed, and I had to accept that. For the first time in a long time, I decided to put myself first. It was a long road ahead, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let anyone make me feel like I didn't matter. I mattered whether they saw it or not.